Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, arguably one of the most important American preachers in history, and certainly one of the most recognizable. Billy Graham's been part of our cultural landscape since at least the mid-20th century. My guest today, Dr. Grant Wacker, is one of the foremost experts on American Christianity in general and Billy Graham in particular. Welcome, Dr. Wacker.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
I'm honored to be here.
Right. So you are the Gilbert T. Rowe Professor Emeritus of Christian History at Duke Divinity School.
I am. Yeah.
You've written
last I checked.
Last you checked.
Yeah, right.
You've written several books and numerous articles. Two books about Billy Graham. The most recent, which we'll kind of focus on today, is One Soul at a Time: The Story of Billy Graham by Eerdmans. Just a little bit of full disclosure here. We have known each other since about 1979. You were my religion professor when I was an undergraduate at University of North Carolina.
Amazing. Yeah.
Later,
and he still talks to me. That's what's amazing. Yeah.
Later, you were on my PhD committee. So we go way back. And I've long been an admirer, of course, of your research and your teaching. And this latest contribution to Understanding American Christianity is just a remarkable book.
Well, thank you. I have to tell a personal story about Ozzie, though. When he first came into my seminar as an undergraduate, he looked like Arnold Schwarzenegger, actually. You were heavy into weightlifting in those days. I'm like, my word, I better be careful here. Yeah.
Well, that was a long time ago. Also, I was a pacifist, so it didn't matter.
Okay. Pacifist Arnold Schwarzenegger.
There you go.
Oh, okay. All right.
Well, I've been so impressed by your scholarship through the years. But this book surpasses all of it, I think. I can't imagine biting off a project as large as trying to write about Billy Graham. I'm curious of, when did you first think you might want to write about Billy Graham? And then how does one get started on such a large project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent a lot of years working on Pentecostalism and evangelicalism in general and foreign missions and some other things. And then I was coming toward the end of my teaching career, and a friend named Mark Knoll, who was teaching at Notre Dame, said to me, well, you're coming near the end. This is a good time to take on a big story, something that will tell us a lot about the American religious experience. And so I thought that's a good idea, but I wanted some focus, not just to tell a big story, but a story that had a focus. And so Mark said, why not Billy Graham? And I think this is interesting in that your friends do a lot. They shape us a lot. Our students shape us, and our friends shape us a lot. And in this case, Mark, very distinguished historian, and he shaped me into thinking, well, Graham could provide a big story, but also a manageable story. There's a kind of a railroad track across the landscape there. And so that's how I started. But there was another part of it, too, in that I grew up in a, Pentecostal world and evangelical world. And Graham was always a premier figure in that world. And so, in a sense, I've been familiar with him since I was a child. And what had impressed me was not his theology, but rather he was not a profound thinker at all. But what impressed me was this extraordinary charisma. And by charisma, I mean a man who could stand in front of 100,000 people, and within seconds, they'd fall silent. And he had this ability, wherever he went, to control that kind of an audience. And I'm not suggesting it was for, malign purposes at all. Sometimes we think charismatic control is a bad thing. I think he simply controlled them by virtue of his presence, a kind of elusive quality. And that fascinated me. How does it happen that a person could go all over the world, preach hundreds or thousands of times, and have the same kind of control over an audience? And so I wanted to know how that happened.
Well, I never saw Billy Graham crusade in person, never met the man. but he was a fixture in our living rooms often growing up. And that same charisma came through the TV screen as well.
Yeah.
And I know you met him in the process of doing this work. Was the charisma there when you sat with him one-on-one as well, or is it something that just came about in the pulpit?
Oh, it was personal. And my wife and I met with him 4 times. He was quite elderly at that time, even more elderly than I was. Okay, and he was probably the first time he was 89, and then we saw him through at the time he was 95, I would say. So 4 times over that span of years, and in his home. And the first time, and my wife was always with me, my wife Catherine. And the first time we met him, well, I was quite intimidated when I thought, I'm going to meet Billy Graham. And his associate, who I like to call his handler, I tease the man, and I said, "You're his handler." He said, "No, I'm an associate." But anyway, his associate said, "Billy, this is Grant, and Grant is writing a book about you." And Mr. Graham, as he's always called in the organization, Mr. Graham looked at me for quite a while. He said, "Why?" And it took me back. I wasn't expecting that question. And so I thought a moment, and then I said, "Well, you've done some important things." And he said, "No, I've done important things with," no, let me rephrase. I missed the quote. He said, "No, the Lord has done important things through me." And I thought that was extraordinary, that the Lord has done important things through me, because he didn't deny that he'd done important things.
Right.
That would have been false modesty. He knew he had. But it was that instant move that it really wasn't me. It was the Lord working through me.
Well, that's a phrase I read several times in your book. After an important crusade, the comment would be something like that, and that seemed to be there seemed to be a pattern of self-deprecating humility about them.
Yeah, and I think it's really an important distinction here. And he didn't think these things through. I mean, he was not a subtle man. He was not a deep thinker. He was not introspective at all. I mean, what you saw, what you got. I mean, and same thing with his preaching. I mean, he didn't search for profound meanings. There was nothing remotely poetic about his preaching. I mean, it was absolutely straightforward. And so I think this was just straightforward. He hadn't reflected on it. It was an instinctive sense that he had done important things, but he should not get the direct credit for it. But if he had denied that he'd done those things, it would have been untruthful. And he wasn't going to lie about it. He said, "Yeah." If I can, for a moment, and just to amplify that, after the last Super Bowl, reporters were interviewing Tom Brady. All right, you don't often go from Billy Graham to Tom Brady, but Tom Brady is a devout Catholic, as many of us know. And the reporter was asking him all about his accomplishments, and then Brady breaks away, and he says, "But it's important to remember, God doesn't care about Super Bowls. So God gave me good eye-hand coordination," which is an understatement, but God doesn't care about that.
Right.
This is, it had the same kind of sense of Billy Graham. He knew what God cared about, and in an enabling sense.
Well, something you said just then that about, I mean, I've always thought of him as poetic in the pulpit. I know what you're saying, and I think my kind of reaction to that is his voice was golden. And that's where the poetry came through.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
me. Not necessarily the words, but just listening to him.
Wonderful point. Yeah. That's an astute observation. It was that voice. He was often compared to Walter Cronkite, and that same resonant voice that commanded an audience. And, wasn't too deep, and certainly wasn't too high. I mean, it just had that, and it had the timbre that commanded attention, and also a slight accent. And we found in the times that we were with him that in person, when he wasn't thinking about his accent, it became a much more southern drawl in person. But preaching to international audiences, especially, he controlled that. Interesting, isn't it, how he can control an accent? But he did control the accent, and so it was more, I'd say mainstream. But even so, he always had that slight Southern accent, which made him distinctive. He's proud of being a Southerner, and it had just enough distinction to arrest attention. Yeah.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, he grew up right outside of Charlotte, or in that area.
He grew up on a farm.
On a farm
outside of Charlotte.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I want to follow up on kind of what you're getting at here. At one point in the book, you said you made a distinction between what Graham said as a preacher and what his audience heard.
Right.
And if you'll forgive me, I want to read a quick sentence here.
Oh, I'll forgive you. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay.
Read all you want.
Which I think gets at that. And I think it's so eloquently written. Letters to Graham leave little doubt that many heard a message that seemed not simplistic, but simple, not repetitive, but reinforcing, not pre-modern, but enduring, not disorganized, but wide-ranging, not alarmist, but timely. And
did I write that?
You wrote that, and it's beautifully written.
Yeah.
And I think it gets at the distinction you're making here, that whatever the critics said about his sermons and the lack of depth or whatever, that's really not what mattered, because that's not what people were hearing. And maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah, thanks, Ozzie. That's a great analysis. I'd summarize it this way: he was not eloquent, but he was effective. And by many measures, I would say you could argue he was the most, well, I'll put it this way: he was the best in the world at what he did. And that could be measured by effectiveness, and that he wanted to communicate. He wanted people to hear him and to internalize what he was saying, and then to act accordingly, stand up, come to the front. So he wanted to communicate and move people to a particular action. And by that measure, I think he was the best in the world at what he did. And he made a point, but he did think, I said he didn't think a lot about what he did, but sometimes he did. And he made a point to use short words, punchy words. He said at one point, I don't know how he got this information, but he said at one point, the average American has a vocabulary of 600 words. Now, I don't know if that's true. I'm sure he didn't know either. But his point was valid, that the average American, and internationally, the average listener had a very finite working vocabulary. And he determined to stay within that working vocabulary, not use flowery phrases. And to the best of my knowledge, he never quoted poetry. That deflected from the point. And at one time, when he was young, when he got older, he tempered this, but when he was young, he compared his preaching to a machine gun. And he spoke very fast when he was young. And he likened his words to bullets. And at one point he said, I'm going to drill the word of God right into them. Well, later on, I'm sure he thought about that more. That isn't quite what you want to do, but early on, but you get the sense of direct, forceful communication.
I was taken by that when I was reading the early chapters or scenes in your book about the firebrand Billy Graham. And that's the Billy Graham before I ever saw him on TV.
Me too.
And then he moderated later on. It seems to me like you said he wanted to communicate. Communication is a two-way street. He certainly understood his target audience if he was thinking about vocabulary and how to shape a message. But one of the things that really interested me about this book was the multiple times that you referenced letters that were written to Billy Graham, from children, from adults, from people who were hurting and in trouble. This was a man who communicated in such a way that he came across as trustworthy enough that strangers would write him about some of the most intimate details of their lives, seeking advice, seeking guidance. How important do you think those letters were to Billy? Did he read them? Did he ever get a sense of any of them? Or
Wonderful question. And let me break down the answer in two parts. And that, in some ways, I think the letters to Graham they're not maybe perhaps the most important part of his story, but they are a very important part, and one that is woefully understudied. And I don't know why those letters have gone understudied, because that's the index to what he was doing and how he was communicating with millions of ordinary people. How do you know he was communicating? Well, partly because literally millions stood up and came forward to register a decision for Christ. So that is one index. But another index, and I think a more telling one, is the letters that people sent him describing their relationship. Over the years, he received millions, literally millions of letters. Most of them have been destroyed for reasons of space. They just couldn't keep them, and confidentiality. But the Billy Graham Archives has kept a few thousand. And so in my work, my wife helped me with this, and we just read through as many as we could in the time available. And it takes a little longer to read them than you think, because often the handwriting is just very difficult to decipher. But you determine you're going to do it. And we tried to read them in a systematic way, and not just random, but, reading. One day we'd read all the A's and then the B's and so forth. And the letters are simply extraordinary for what they tell us about the audience. I would say about half of them are letters of appreciation. Thank you for coming to our town. Thank you for this message. But maybe half of them were letters of personal revelation, pain, grief, sadness about a divorce, sadness about a child who's gone astray, surprisingly often children who are in prison, and how can I continue to be a good mother, a good father, and my son has been sentenced to 10 to 20 years and 30 years in prison. How do I do this? A lot of the letters spoke of addiction, ranging smoking, drinking, gambling, not rarely masturbation. A lot of addictive behavior. So they were revealing. And why would they tell Billy Graham about any of this? They had, most people knew that he would never know them.
Right. And
my own amateur analysis of this is that the letters were often a kind of a Protestant form of a Catholic confessional. Mm-hmm. Just sharing this with someone you trusted was a way of, in a sense, coming to terms with, maybe repenting. Sometimes letters would say, I know perfectly well that I will never conquer this or that addiction, but I just have to tell someone about it. And so that very much touched me. But I'd say another kind of letter, another genre of letter, were those of the returning pilgrim. So many of the people said, I grew up in church, and then, I went to college, or I went in the army or whatever, and I drifted from the church. And I went many years without any connection with the church. And then you came to town, and I turned on the radio, and I heard you preaching. And I knew it was time for me to become the terms of my life.
I love your analysis of these letters acting as a kind of Protestant confession.
Yeah,
but I do think there is a regardless of the spiritual benefit, there's a psychological benefit to that, and that's one thing I've always felt Protestants were lacking. And I think and Billy Graham has been compared to the Protestant Pope or called that.
Absolutely, I should also say many of the letters are very funny, especially the letters from children. I mean, I love the letters from children. A child writes in one of the, I won't say typical because it stood out, but one I will remember is probably from about a first grader. And he has all the usual stuff, about, describing himself and his parents' height, his parents' weight, Children are often very precise about these things. You know, my mother is 32 and a half, and she weighs, you know, so much. And so children are precise about this. And then, as they often did, they said, I'm writing because I would like a book and stickers. Okay. But then at the end, this little guy, after the typical letter, this little guy says, tell Mr. Jesus hi for me. It's very revealing. You know, in popular culture, that sense of Sir Billy's connection with
Billy and Jesus, or
Billy and Jesus,
buddies.
popular. Another one of the letters I love is the envelopes are quite interesting in themselves. Many, many letters. The envelopes simply say Billy Graham, USA, or Billy Graham, Minnesota, or whatever, where his office was. I mean, but he got them. I mean, you know, the post office knew where he was. But one that was fully addressed, had all the details, zip code and everything. Down in the lower left, it said, in case of rapture, never mind. So, all right.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Well, so as I was reading your story of Billy Graham, your depiction of Billy Graham, I got to thinking you're describing Billy Graham with three words that start with C. So the three C's to me are character, charisma, which you've already addressed, and calling. So I began to kind of frame my reading along those lines. And so I'm wondering if you could maybe comment on character, the character of Billy Graham, because that seems to be one thing that stands out in an enduring way.
It's wonderful questions. I don't want to embarrass Ozzie, but these are astute questions. And I had never really thought of the three C's in the book, but that's exactly right. Character. It's an elusive word, not elusive, but elusive word, elusive concept, exactly what is character. And I would say that in Graham's case, it was a steadiness, a steady commitment to doing one thing, staying focused on, I'll skip to that word calling, but I'll say more about it in a minute, but staying focused on his calling. He was often offered just extraordinary amounts of money to do other things, to go into politics, even to run for president of the United States, which amazingly enough, you know, he was nowhere qualified for such a thing, but I mean, people urged him to run for president. And at one point he seemed actually almost to think about running for senator from North Carolina, but he didn't. And he was offered different amounts of money by advertisers or other networks, and just staggering, eye-popping amounts of money. He never considered it. And it was that laser focus on pursuing that calling that I think constituted the core of his character. He did not deviate. An undeviating commitment to doing what he think he ought to do.
And how would he describe that calling? To reach souls for Christ? Is that the way he would have interpreted that?
Well, interestingly, he never had one of these epiphany callings.
Right.
You know, he never had a Damascus Road experience. And sometimes it was depicted that way in biographies by other biographers who got it wrong. You know, I mean, I got it right. I mean, he didn't really have a Damascus Road experience. He had one experience once on his fiance had jilted him, and he was in Florida, and he was young, and he was on a golf course, and it was a moonlit night, and he said he fell to his knees and prayed out his heart to God. And obviously, he was in great distress because his girlfriend had left him. And years later, I mean, he's describing this and said, at that moment, I knew that I had been called to Christian service. And perhaps so. He never, ever once, as far as I know, said that he was called to be an evangelist. That awareness evolved.
It's interesting.
Kind of a gradual awareness of who he was. And Martin Marty, a great historian that Ozzie and I know his work a lot, but Martin Marty, a Lutheran historian, theologian, once said that if 1,000 pieces of your life all fit together, then you've been called. And I've had that sense with Graham. 1,000 pieces of his life fit together. And so there was no doubt on his mind that he'd been called. So what had he been called to? He'd been called to call people to Christ. He never pretended to be a theologian. He never pretended to have astute insights about the great theological conundrum. He simply said, I'm called to invite people to come to Christ, to commit their lives to Christ.
And then he made that call, and then he sort of left it, right? I mean, and then it was up to the individual and God.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I mean, in a way, it was a very American approach. He had very little sense of the church as a nurturing institution. If you were sitting here, you'd say, oh, well, sure, the church is and should be a nurturing institution. He had very little sense of the institutional church. Had little to no sense of the power of sacraments. Little to no sense of the power of liturgy. This was just not part of his worldview. He was a Southern American evangelist, and his task was to issue this invitation and then let God do the rest.
I've just been kind of dumbfounded reading through the book of how traveled he was. I knew this, but as I read it, it just seemed impossible that he could have gone to all these places and done all these things. How close he was to so many presidents. And that was really, so he had a complicated relationship with fame and with politics, it seems to me. And he was always trying to balance the draw toward this or that. The fact that he wasn't drawn in, is that an expression of his character as well, you think, that laser focus that you were talking about?
Well, first let's talk about the travel. I mean, that's a very good point. In the last third of his life, probably the majority of his crusades and meetings were international. I define international as outside Canada and the United States. And it's hard to tabulate these things exactly, because exactly what is a meeting and what is not. But on the whole, it's pretty clear that the majority of his public events, we'll call them that way, were outside the United States and Canada. And he felt that, again, he'd been called to express a global gospel. All right. He was an American, and he understood that. I'm an American, but he said the gospel transcends my Americanness. Okay. So being traveled and aware of the world, I think, is very much a part of the Billy Graham story. He took the message internationally. He saw a lot of people, and their lives impacted him. So the impact of the international is an important part of the Billy Graham story. Now, I'm going to get the second part of your question, and that is his relation with presidents and celebrities. I've spoken very admiring terms of Graham, and I embrace them. I in no way apologize for them. But I'll also say there were some downsides to his story, by my calculation and by his own. And one of his patterns, which he later bitterly regretted, was his involvement with partisan politics. And there was a phase of his life in which he was very much like his son, Franklin Graham. And he was deeply involved in partisan politics. He always pretended that he wasn't. And I don't know if there's ever a time that Franklin has pretended that he wasn't. But Graham, the senior Graham, pretended that he was not partisan, but in fact he was. There's just no question about it. He was working very hard behind the scenes. He was a moderately conservative Republican, always a registered Democrat, from birth to death, a registered Democrat. He said that being a Southerner and being a Democrat were all the same thing for him. Yeah, this is the old kind of Democratic Party. All right. This is in the old days. All right. But he was a Democrat from beginning to end. However, most of his political preferences were Republican. Not always. I think his closest friend was Lyndon Johnson.
Mm.
And outside of his immediate associates, his closest friend was Lyndon Johnson. Hubert Humphrey is a very good friend. So he did have some Democratic associations. On the whole, though, moderate Republican. And then he was pretty clear where his preferences lay. And in the 1952 election with Eisenhower, he said, I can raise 50 million votes from evangelicals for Eisenhower. But I'm not partisan. He's playing a game here. Now, later on, this came to bite him very seriously because, as we all know, Richard Nixon got into trouble in many ways. And Graham defended Nixon almost to the end. At a certain point, when Graham read the Nixon Watergate tapes, is when he finally saw that he could no longer keep defending Nixon. And he later said, when I read the tapes, I almost vomited. And there's a pathos there because he felt loyalty to a close friend. And his friend had let him down. And, just the most grievous way, his friend had betrayed that friendship. And so Billy was mortified and heartbroken over what he read. Well, this was in 1974. And almost from that moment thereafter, Graham started to back away from that partisanship. And he said, I did wrong by letting my loyalties flow in partisan channels this way. And then he even came to broaden it out to say, I've done wrong by being so pro-American. And later on, he'd say, well, why can't the United States be more like Canada? See, Canada doesn't go around trying to police the world. That's a very interesting phrase. And Canada doesn't try to police the world, so why do we have to do that? And so he began to back away in a lot of ways. He apologized repeatedly for his involvement in politics. He never quite exonerated himself, though. I mean, once in a while, he fell back into it. He just couldn't stay out of it. Like a moth drawn to the flame. I mean, he couldn't quite stay out of it. But he understood the problem, and he understood the mistake he had made. And he said, I plead with the younger men, for them, younger men coming into this calling of evangelist, stay out of politics.
Not many people follow that advice.
No, and that's the message that his son did not follow.
Right.
Now, what we need to, or one of his sons, now, what we need to recognize, though, I think, I don't want to misstate this, though Graham retreated from partisan politics, it's important to acknowledge that he created the public space that politicians would later occupy and invoke the church.
Right.
So his son, Franklin, did in fact come to occupy a public space that the father had created.
That's really an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Well, as always, I have enjoyed my time with you.
We're already finished.
Unfortunately, we
Yeah.
could talk about this all day. I appreciate your sense of humor and your penetrating insight. And for this book, a remarkable story about a remarkable man.
Thank
and it's
you.
well told. So thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this week on Religion and Life. And that's it for this season for Religion and Life. We sure hope you'll join us on App TV next season as we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, and society. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.